Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our the first in our series of webinars focused on Copilot for Microsoft 365. I'm Sean Gilbride, your host and Chief Technology Officer at Daymark Solutions. Really thrilled to have you join us today as we explore some of the capabilities and benefits of Copilot for Microsoft 365. This will be a 7-part series where we review what Copilot for Microsoft 365 has to offer. And over the next few weeks, we'll review what you can expect to gain by using Copilot for M365, some of the prerequisites for implementation and considerations. We'll actually demonstrate some of the capabilities, not in today's session, but in some future sessions. We'll go over prompting best practices, as well as explore some of the capabilities that Microsoft has to offer beyond Microsoft Copilot for M365. Today's session will set the stage for many of these topics, and we'll provide an overview of Copilot for M365. Throughout this series, our plan is to highlight some of the strengths as well as be candid about some of the weaknesses that we've encountered during our testing. Joining me today is Mike O'Connor, one of our senior solution architects, and Jared Kenefick, one of our senior cloud architects focused on modern workplace solutions. Both Mike and Jared bring a wealth of knowledge and expertise that'll be invaluable to these discussions. We encourage you to ask questions throughout through the Q&A function of this webinar, and we'll do our best to answer these questions throughout the sessions. Today's session will provide information on how Copilot can enhance your productivity, drive some collaboration, and streamline workflows. This will be an introductory level discussion and will set the stage for future topics. We're going to start today with an abbreviated history of AI development over the last few decades, and we'll then focus on more recent advancements of GPT and more specifically Copilot for M365. With that, I'm going to turn the discussion over to Mike O'Connor.
Thank you, Sean. Okay, a very abbreviated history of kind of how we got here in terms of copilots. This is just intended to give some broad context as a backdrop for some of the concepts that we'll discuss, maybe give some definitions to some terms and things like that. So starting all the way back in the 1960s, natural language processing really wasn't even brand new in the 60s. Alan Turing had been working on it notably in the 40s. And it had existed conceptually even long, before then. But we did start seeing some really interesting kind of programmatic examples in the 60s. A notable one included ELIZA, which was an early chatbot, really, which was created by a fellow by the name of Joseph Weizenbaum at MIT in the mid to late 60s. It was very rudimentary. It kind of reformulated what you said to it back in the form of a question. It was meant to be kind of like a psychoanalyst in that regard. But it still had very, very broad and wide implications in the field. And it even won a Peabody as recently as 2021. So very long-lasting implications there. In the 80s is when we kind of in earnest started to see the emergence of language models. It's important to designate that these were small language models for obvious reasons, but I guess taking a step back, a language model in and of itself is really just a statistical representation of natural language that's geared toward prediction. And some of these language models, IBM created the first, what was considered significant statistical language model in 1980. And we saw a lot of advancements from there on N-gram word models, or language models, I should say, were quite ubiquitous all the way up through the 90s when we started seeing the emergence of neural networks and feed-forward neural networks and things like that. So named because they kind of resemble structurally how neurons in our brains fire when we memorize and recall and analyze and things like that. In the 2000s is when we really started to see a big jump forward in terms of recurrent neural networks, specifically bidirectional recurrent neural networks. And these improved those prior feed-forward networks. They could iterate forward or backward. They could feed results back into inputs and really made a significant jump forward. Really up until 2017, those were the predominant models that were used in machine learning around language. It was in 2017 that there was a landmark paper that was published. It was called Attention is All You Need. It was published by some researchers at Google and the University of Toronto. And it put forth the concept of the transformer network. Now, RNNs, their kind of Achilles heel was that they were sequential. So when you iterated over long blocks of text, oftentimes, when you get to the end of it, they would lose context from the beginning. And what transformers did where they allowed for simultaneous processing of individual components within a large block of text, for example, and didn't require that you iterate over everything. So you could analyze individual blocks in parallel, and that parallelism is what really opened the floodgates to large language models and things like that. So it was in 2018 that we started to see a lot of implementations of those LLMs, those transformer models, notably Google's BERT. So BERT is, it stands for bidirectional encoder representations from transformers. It's an encoder-only model, so it's not geared toward generative AI. It's geared toward analysis and classification of language and things like that. But it's used very heavily in terms of, semantic analysis of your searches in Google and things of that nature. Of course, around the same time, we saw OpenAI come out with GPT. GPT is a generative pre-trained transformer. So it is a transformer model. It is generative, so it's a decoder type of model, and it's pre-trained. So usually these models are trained in a unsupervised or self-supervised way, where they kind of make guesses at what should come next and iterate over that and improve over time on their own, followed by semi-supervised or supervised learning, where humans interact with them and kind of nudge them in the direction that they want them to. And there is also a concept of fine tuning, which can come later on. We're going to talk about sort of a significant example of that as well. So over the next several years, GPT improved. We saw GPT-2, GPT-3, 3.5. I think it's worth noting that these were not just incremental improvements. These were orders of magnitude in terms of computational power, the number of petaflops that was used to process them, the amount of data that was used to analyze. And it was a very significant jumps forward with each subsequent family, resulting in 2022 with ChatGPT, which was based on GPT 3.5 initially, and then later GPT-4. If transformers are the reason that we're here talking about this stuff today, ChatGPT is the reason that everybody outside of our industry is very well aware of this and talking about it as well. ChatGPT made this very much on the public's mind, and was instrumental in kind of bringing it to light in that sense. So over the next year, Microsoft, they had already invested about $1 billion into OpenAI, but between 2022 and 2023, Microsoft invested just a little bit more, $10 billion investment in OpenAI, established a really good mutually beneficial partnership. And the OpenAI project uses predominantly Azure Compute for processing their models and things of that nature. And Microsoft in 2023, when they released Copilot, it was based on GPT-4, a fine-tuned model of GPT-4. And that kind of gets us up to date to today. I'm not going to say any more about Copilot just yet, because I'm going to turn it over to Sean, and he's going to talk a little bit more about what Copilot is.
Perfect. Thanks, Mike. Take control back. So moving forward, what is Copilot for M365? Copilot combines the power of large language models with your data accessed through Microsoft Graph, which is essentially what connects all of the Microsoft ecosystem together, and your Microsoft 365 apps, all accessed through natural language. Allows you to turn your words into a productivity tool effectively. GPT-4 Turbo is used as the foundational large language model. As Mike said, that's a fine-tuned model. It's not just GPT-4. The Microsoft Graph API allows you to access your data and insights through the Microsoft Cloud. So things like Microsoft 365, Windows, enterprise mobility and security, et cetera. It just connects everything together. And finally, the Microsoft 365 apps themselves. Copilot allows you to access things like your calendar, your email, your chats, documents, meetings, contacts, allows you to kind of get insights and context that you'd never have before. So you can ask natural language questions like, what are my action items from last week related to XYZ project? I'm joining a meeting late. Give me a summary of the key action items that have been discussed thus far in this meeting, and it will provide those back to you in relative short order. Copilot for M365 is built on Microsoft's comprehensive approach to security. So, what does this all mean? It means that, there are several integrated tools that are going to be leveraged here. From a security perspective, Services like enterprise mobility and security are providing controls such as DLP, conditional access, information protection, etc. Purview is going to be used for things like compliance, giving you access to sensitivity labeling, data classification, and governance. And it's also used for encryption of the underlying data. And lastly, Microsoft has come up with 6 responsible AI principles that enable things like fairness and reliability and safety and inclusiveness and transparency to make sure that this is an enterprise class solution, but also that it doesn't kind of go off the rails in any one direction. In simple terms, Copilot's not creating new security constructs, but it does highlight some of the additional security considerations that we all need to have. But Copilot's going to respect existing controls, which many of you have in place today. But if you don't leverage these tools today, it's something you're going to need to consider before you move forward with Copilot for M365. Now, here is Microsoft's Copilot unified architecture. I'm not going to go through this slide in detail. It's certainly an eye chart, but I did want to give you some perspective on where Microsoft's integration is at this point, and really some context on where we think all of this is going over the next few years. To date, Microsoft has stated that Copilot has been integrated into north of 400 services across Azure and 365, which is really impressive given that we're talking about this happening over the span of 12 to 14 months. This rapid integration, however, does come with some limitations, right? We also have to remind ourselves how new some of these large language models are. And what we've seen is some pretty limited capability and certain tools that Microsoft has exposed to date. An example of this is Copilot Studio, which is a no-code custom Copilot toolset. In testing, we found that Copilot Studio is very limited in some of its capabilities and its maturity. For example, we can create a chatbot that queries a curated document repository, but we can't fine-tune for accuracy versus creativity. You might want creative results for a marketing department or more fact-based results for something that's scientific, maybe healthcare or biotech or legal use cases, for example. We can't really get it to return multiple results. It seems to pick one at random. I think we've all heard that AI in some cases works a little bit like a black box. You don't always know where the results come from, but it's going to look across that repository, and it may give you very different results each time you query. Also, you can't really have great iterative conversations that build contextually on prior conversations, which would improve the context and result. We can't teach it to better understand context and content from the front. And the repository options are limited. And lastly, it's confined to GPT-4 Turbo today. All of this and more is possible with other tools like Azure AI Studio, which gives you a lot more control over the creation of that chatbot, the language models used, the type of responses, the tone of those responses, the number of responses, and you can ask very iterative questions that improve contextually the results each time. We do expect to see rapid improvement over the next 12 to 24 months in these areas, but it's important to note that not all tools are fully mature at this point. To put it all in perspective, OpenAI is already talking about GPT-5 and the intent to really maintain the same improvement increment from version to version. Microsoft's also placing pretty significant investment in this area and will continue to enhance their copilots over time. One of the recent articles I read was that Microsoft is actually going to triple their data center footprint entirely because of AI. AI is driving a lot of activity. It's very demanding on the Azure environment, so they've already committed to tripling their investment in their data center footprint. We've also read that Microsoft's going to use AI to understand nuclear power regulations with the goal of using nuclear power plants to drive, to power their data center footprint. In other words, they're looking to purchase and or build their own nuclear power supply specifically to power AI data centers. So why would all of this matter? Power is really, or power generation is really the biggest limiting factor today for AI from an infrastructure perspective. To give you an idea, a typical rack in a data center is going to use between or supply between 10 and 25 kilowatts of power on average, 25 being the high end. A single NVIDIA DGX node is going to draw about 10 kilowatts of power, which means you could put a single piece of equipment in a typical rack. And obviously that does not scale very well. If you take a more macro view, hyperscaler data centers generally today have between 40 megawatts of usable power to 100 or maybe 125 megawatts of total power supply. Whereas a nuclear power plant can drive a gigawatt of power. So a 10x increase over the largest hyperscalers today. You put all this in context and you can really see with these investments from companies like OpenAI and Microsoft where this is all going and what you might be able to expect in relative short order in terms of improvement in capability and power behind some of these large language models and tool sets like Copilot. Mike, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thank you, Sean. Okay, so this is meant to be kind of a high-ish level overview of sort of the input-output workflow of a Copilot prompt and response. So as you can see here, a user issues a prompt to Copilot. Copilot does what's called grounding in LLM terms. It essentially it uses contextual information to kind of optimize and organize that prompt in a way to ensure relevance, ensure efficacy of the response and things like that. So it's going to reach out to its Graph API. For those not familiar, Microsoft's Graph API is essentially kind of a back-end interconnected network for communication across the entire 365 ecosystem. So it's going to talk to the Microsoft Graph API, it's going to establish context, and it's going to reformat your prompt before presenting it to its large language model. Once presented to the large language model, it's going to adhere to responsible AI principles, or you see RAI there, to ensure that there's no dangerous responses, to ensure that the user is not attempting to do anything malicious. And it's going to issue that response back to Copilot. Copilot is then going to go back to the Graph API to ensure that any response that you're going to receive adheres to all of the security principles that you have. Copilot is beholden to those security principles, whether it's purview or information protection or sensitivity labels or things like that. It's going to ensure that it's not violating any of those things before it issues that response back to you, the user. So there's a lot going on under the hood in a prompt and response kind of back and forth. The two main takeaways I would say are, one, it's doing a lot to optimize and ensure that you're getting a relevant response. And two, it is very, very laser focused on security as well as responsible AI principles, ensuring that you're not getting access to information that you should not have access to. Also worth noting, it's not training this language model. One of the problems that we see with like publicly available resources, like ChatGPT, for example, actually uses user input to train that model in real time. And the problem with that is that you can leak important personal information, corporate information, IP, things of that nature. This model is not trained by your prompts, by your information, by the data that's in your Microsoft ecosystem either. Additionally, all of this communication is encrypted as well. So heavily focused on security.
Yeah, just to add to that, Mike, it's a very important data point there that Microsoft is not training the model and OpenAI is not training the model based on the prompts that you're providing here. Whereas some of the public large language models do exactly that. So regardless of your stance on Copilot for M365, if you haven't thought about it, you may want to consider preventing access or limiting access to some of those public tools unless end users really understand what they should and shouldn't be using those tools for, because inadvertently you could leak IP or other sensitive information to the business.
Yeah, great point. Thanks, Sean. Okay, so what does Copilot for some of these individual applications actually look like? I do want to state right now that this is intended to just kind of be a high-level overview of these things. We will, in subsequent sessions, do demonstrations and get really much more deep into how you can interact with these various applications. So at a high level, Microsoft Word is going to allow you to create information. You could prompt Copilot, you could ask it to generate information, you could highlight text that you've created, ask it to refine that for you, to summarize it for you, extrapolate from it, etc. So very useful with Word. Excel is going to be a little bit of a different interaction. You can prompt Copilot and ask for information on creating specific formulas, make recommendations on how to implement formulas to get the sort of data that you're looking for. You could ask it how to interpret data. It could give you recommendations around graphs and tables and things of that nature. PowerPoint's heavily geared toward creativity. It's very flexible. You could ask Copilot for PowerPoint to generate a full PowerPoint deck based on a Word document that you have and the information in it. You could ask it to help you better refine your templates or things of that nature. With Outlook, this is really useful for doing things like creating emails. You can ask it to assist in kind of the semantics or the way that your language sounds and help to refine it in that way. You could ask it to summarize a super lengthy email thread and just give you a bulleted list of the important things and action items that might come out of that. With Teams, especially with recorded meetings like we're recording right now, Teams can give you a summary. It can give you action items automatically based on the transcript, and can be really useful for general collaboration in that regard. And OneNote, so you can prompt Copilot to take your notes, refine them, consolidate them, create a to-do list from them, or even just kind of bring some clarity to kind of a messy chunk of raw notes that you have from a meeting or something like that. As we've kind of alluded to and we'll speak more to, these are constantly evolving and improving over time. So we expect to see additional applications supporting Copilot and additional features and functionality within these applications. And again, we'll get into what it looks like interacting with these in demonstration form in subsequent webinars.
Yeah, just to add to that, and I'll use Word as an example here. Today, as Mike said, you can select existing text and have it rewrite that text. You can ask it to write it in a more casual manner, a more professional manner. So you can set the tone for the content that it's creating. But one of the limiting factors is it doesn't understand your writing style. So for example, we all have unique writing styles, and you will find that you're locked into the tones that Microsoft is providing today. We do expect in the future that it will be more intelligent, be able to look at past content that you've written and write something that's more in tune with the way that you would actually write content. Another example would be for PowerPoint, for example. It's something that we've done some testing on. It can create, as Mike said, a presentation based on a document that you provide. But some of the things that we found is the quality of those presentations aren't super high quality, but they can get you started. And really the source content matters. The structure of that content, the quality of that content really matters in terms of the result that you're going to get. So if you have a document that's not well structured or might jump around a lot, you can expect that the PowerPoint is going to reflect that very quickly. So.
Yep, all good points. Thanks, Sean. Okay, so netting some of this out, just sort of summarizing it. Copilot is grounded in your data. That's a deliberately used word, right? We know grounding means it's establishing context and really using your data and your information in order to get you the most relevant information possible. Very comprehensive from a security and privacy perspective. It's automatically going to inherit your organization's security, compliance, privacy policies from 365. You don't require new tools around security, but it bears mentioning that the security tools that you're using and the way that you're using them definitely become more important when you're deploying Copilot. So it's really important that you have those things well dialed in before deploying Copilot. And Jared's going to talk a little bit more about some of those. We're going to get even more into depth as the webinar goes on. But it's architected to protect your data. Remember, it's not training the models. It's not leaking data anywhere. Everything is encrypted. Everything is really architected from the ground up in order to ensure that your data is protected and respected. highly integrated into the applications that we're talking about. You don't need to go launch a different browser, a different application, or anything like that. They all make it very easy to leverage Copilot from within these applications without having to leave them, and so highly or tightly integrated into various applications and into the Microsoft ecosystem in general. You're always in control. It's not as though this is going to go send off an email with a Copilot generated response to somebody or something like that. You don't have to accept any of the suggestions that it makes. And I think that it's also a good time to mention that it's as important as ever to review what it's creating for you, to fact check it, to edit it, and ultimately to use your own judgment in utilizing it, because you can't assume that it's going to be a perfect response. As we know and we've seen, things can happen, and it may not be what you expect. So it doesn't remove the reliance on the user of Copilot to proofread, of course, right? And it's designed to learn. So, like I mentioned before, this is designed to improve over time iteratively. And we've already seen improvements. We expect to see further improvements, further integrations into different ecosystem platforms and things like that as time goes on very rapidly. So with that, to talk to some of those principles that I mentioned, I'm going to turn it over to Jared.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. Okay, so we've already brushed on, preparing your data. Copilot can be enabled for a few people without too much of a consideration, some IT testers and things of that nature. But when you're considering expanding across your organization, you will need to be thinking about preparing your data for Copilot. Because as you know, when you prompt for Copilot information, it'll leverage your existing permissions, as we've mentioned. But you don't necessarily know unless you've done your due diligence. There could be information, sensitive information that someone has access to that you're not quite aware of. And Copilot will potentially serve that up depending on the prompt. So that is important to know. It's a good catalyst to get you, into a state where your data is more organized. You're ensuring that your Teams, SharePoint, or OneDrive is serving up relevant content for that individual. So that's important. There are some questions to be asking, right? Do you have access controls around everything that you should? What does your user lifecycle management look like? When a user changes departments, right? Are they removed from old access and given new access? So these are important things to be looking at. There's tools that can do this, right? I'll go into those in a sec, but data identification, right? Classification, governance. On our next webinar, I am going to be going into deeper into preparedness and readiness, but just some of the things to at a high level you'd be looking to do. As a first step, you want to spend time in a discovery phase, as I've been mentioning. So identifying gaps, classifying documents, identifying sensitive data, verifying your access controls. You want to be performing a gap analysis. This this needs to happen prior, right? So you want to do this prior to introducing Copilot across your organization, right? Outside of just a small little POC team that's okay with potentially getting served up something they shouldn't. So that's important. Once you've established that, you want to get into the actual actionable items, right? So you want to be going through a process of label and classification. You want to be locking down who can create team sites. You want to be making sure that you're introducing, potentially leveraging Microsoft's tools like access reviews to check group memberships or access to SharePoint sites. Entitlement management, which you can use that to create packages. Those are all in the Entra P2 licensing. model. So, user onboards, they get access to what they need. A user changes departments, they're removed and get access to what they need at the other department. So that kind of control is going to really help you feel secure with your data preparedness and your data readiness for Copilot. So, once you've done all that, you really need to also be thinking about your adoption strategy, right? How do we get Copilot adopted across your organization? You want to put together a team like you would with a typical large scale, adoption. You want to make sure you're including, your key IT personnel that are going to be kind of fielding this project, but also your business players, your stakeholders. It's important that the folks that you've identified as being, high value targets are involved in the beginning. You want to develop your test case. You want to make your business case, I should say. You want to make sure that you're including, again, business stakeholders that are friendly to IT, that you think it's going to be useful for them to be using it. So consider across your organization who can really gain the value that Copilot offers here. Pay attention to the usage, across your adoption team. So when you're early on in the project, you want to be having a feedback loop going on where people are providing you, they're using it, they're providing you information. There are ways to check it. You can look at reports, but don't be afraid to just redeploy a license to someone who's going to use it, right? Because you want to get the most out of your P2C process before introducing to the rest of the organization. So adoption strategy is important, and it is something to be thinking about. As we've mentioned multiple times, it's in its infancy. This is year one. So, some of the components are not fully baked yet. There's more to come. We're laying the groundwork, as we say. Copilot for M365 is it's an exciting product. It needs to be evolved, and it will be. But here laying the groundwork. If you think about M365 and where that's gotten to, that was adopted in 2011. It's just exploded. So I think we can expect a similar trajectory for Copilot, and for Microsoft, having invested billions of dollars to really give it a lot of attention. And I think we'll see the fruits of that as we go. So again, limitations around data hygiene and protection, and in particular end user training, right? We want to make sure that they can use the product, so that it's at $30 used per license, right? We want to make sure that it's being utilized. Patience. We say that it requires patience because it can be an iterative process, right? When you're looking to get information, you don't always get what you want. You might have to change your prompt. Sometimes sending the same prompt, right, gets you different information each time. So again, those are some of the woes of large language models. That's improving with every iteration. So I think we can expect some of these things to get easier. Yeah, but that's important. And of course, job functions, right? So not everyone is going to be able to leverage all of the value in Copilot, depending on what they do. So consider, where it makes sense. In those high value targets, I would start with those to, again, build your business case, as I mentioned before. So yeah, not all features work reliably, like we mentioned. So again, just paying attention to things like, we noticed coaching and Outlook is a little behind, I would say, but you can get some value out of that. But just consider that there's more room to grow there and to improve. Converting documents to PowerPoint. Those are just a few examples that we wanted to mention. We'll get further into that again in future webinar sessions. Is that Sean?
And just
Perfect.
before you
Yeah,
hand that over to Sean, I just
Yep.
wanted to address a question. I apologize to the asker that I missed this when it first came in. The question was whether or not we had seen anybody using Salesforce integration yet. Heard people talking about it. I haven't personally seen anybody using Salesforce integration with Copilot yet. I'll defer to Sean and Jared if they have. But otherwise, we can take that as an action item to keep our eyes out and see if there's any relevant information and maybe bring that to some future webinars if there are.
yeah, same response from my side. I haven't seen anybody doing that yet. I think it's, important to note that if we look across our customers that are adopting, which there's quite a few right now adopting Copilot for M365, most are doing so in a POC capacity, right? They're buying 10 licenses, 20 licenses, giving them to key stakeholders across the business, a few IT representatives, a few security representatives, for example, and really just kicking the tires, getting a sense of where can we extract the most value from this, which use cases make the most sense for us. We haven't yet seen any wide scale adoption, and I think that makes perfect sense with all the stuff we've already talked about today. But we do expect to see that change in pretty short order. So jumping into some of the cost and purchasing options. First off, the license for the Copilot for M365 is an a la carte license, so it's not included in the vast majority of bundles today. Unlike the initial release, there's no longer a minimum, so you can buy as few as one license or as many as you'd like. And the cost is $30 per user per month with a minimum 1-year commitment if you're under a CSP, or a 3-year commitment if you're under an enterprise agreement. From a payment perspective, you're paying annually. There's no monthly pay. So you add that up over across a number of users. It's not a cheap license, certainly, and that's why we see customers, starting with a small number of licenses to really get a sense of what can Copilot do for my organization and what's it going to take to deploy it at a wider scale. From a prerequisite perspective, you do have to have M365 Business, Standard, or Premium. You need to have Office 365 E3 or E5, or Microsoft 365 E3 or E5 licensing. And down here, I just show that there are a few select bundles which do include Copilot for M365, those being Dynamics for 365 Sales Enterprise and Sales Copilot. Both include the Copilot for M365 licensing, but that is an exception. How can Daymark help? So Daymark is a Microsoft Direct CSP, so we can obviously help you with license procurement and provisioning. Helped a number of customers to date in this area. We also are providing Copilot readiness workshops where we can assess the security readiness of your environment, help you deploy things like Purview to get you access to information protection and sensitivity labels, and really helping you understand some of the implications around enabling Copilot in the environment. Some of the considerations that you're going to need to go through in advance to make sure that you're getting the most out of it, and at the same time not exposing information to users that you may not want to. And lastly, completely separate from Copilot for M365, which has a lot of these kind of foundational requirements, we're seeing a lot of interest in custom Copilot creation. And we can work with your team to help create and deploy a custom Copilot, which is built for your business needs specifically. This is going to be using tools like Azure AI Studio, where you can get really fine-grained control over what the Copilot does for your organization, and really has specific business line of business value. We did get another question coming in around Copilot Analytics. Let me just read this real quick. Yeah, so the question is, found that the Copilot Analytics provided by Microsoft are really lacking at this point, and do we see, investment in that space? That's absolutely an area where we expect to see a lot of improvement in pretty short order. The way I look at this, and I think Jared hit on this, if you look at just M365 specifically over the last decade or so, there's been a lot of advancement. If you just think about COVID, for example, the last 3 years, you've seen massive improvements in things like Teams and some of the M365 tooling. There's been a very significant investment, and in many ways, that's the same as what we expect to see for Copilot, if not even more. With some of the investments we've talked about Microsoft making around their data center footprints and the progress that OpenAI is making, we expect to see some very rapid advancements across the entire stack for Copilot. And that is it for today. I want to thank everybody for joining us for our first session on Microsoft Copilot for 365. Hope you got a lot out of today's session. We do have a number of sessions planned over the next few weeks, which are coming up and noted here. Hope that you'll join us there. You can hit our website to register for those. At this point, we'll end the webinar. We'll leave it running for a few minutes in case there's any last minute questions here. But if not, thanks again for joining and hope to see you next time.